Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we will spend some quiet time exploring a place that has been described for many years as one of the most unusual houses in England. The story unfolds in a small rural village, where an ordinary-looking building gradually became associated with reports that captured public curiosity across the country. What makes this case particularly interesting is not only the events themselves, but the mixture of personal experiences, investigation, belief, and skepticism that developed around it over time. If you are new here, this channel is designed for calm listening and relaxation. The narration moves slowly and gently, without dramatic intensity or disturbing detail, so you can unwind, focus, or fall asleep comfortably while learning about real historical stories. Many listeners use these videos as part of their nighttime routine because the steady pacing helps the mind settle. If you find this kind of content helpful, you are always welcome to subscribe and leave a like, as it supports the growth of the channel and allows more people to discover peaceful, long-form storytelling. The location we are exploring tonight is Borley Rectory, a house that once stood near the border of Essex and Suffolk. Over several decades, individuals connected to the building reported experiences they could not easily explain, including unusual sounds, objects appearing to move, and other disturbances that attracted attention beyond the local community. Some visitors believed they had witnessed something unusual, while others questioned whether natural explanations might account for what was reported. The range of perspectives contributed to the lasting reputation of the site. Situations involving houses and unexplained reports often reflect the interaction between environment, memory, and expectation. Buildings carry histories shaped by the people who live within them, and stories can develop gradually as experiences are shared. Over time, these narratives may become part of local folklore, blending observation with interpretation. In the case of Borley Rectory, the combination of personal accounts and public investigation created a story that continues to be discussed long after the structure itself disappeared. As we move through this narrative together, you may notice how easily belief and doubt can exist side by side when events are difficult to explain. Human perception is shaped by context, emotion, and prior expectation, and unusual environments can amplify awareness of small details. Whether the events were influenced by psychological factors, environmental conditions, or something less easily understood, the experiences reported at Borley remain part of the broader conversation about how people interpret unexplained situations. For now, allow yourself to settle comfortably. You might take a slow breath, relax your shoulders, and let the rhythm of the narration guide your thoughts into a calmer place. There is no need to focus on every detail. You can simply listen as the story unfolds gradually, while the quiet of the night continues around you. The village of Borley is a small rural settlement located in the English countryside near the border, between Essex and Suffolk. Surrounded by farmland, narrow country roads, and scattered cottages, it has long been characterized by a quiet pace of life shaped by agriculture and tradition. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, communities like Borley were often closely connected, with residents familiar with one another through church, local events, and shared routines. The calm atmosphere of such villages can create a strong sense of continuity, where changes or unusual events are quickly noticed and discussed among neighbours. At the heart of many English villages during this period was the parish church, which served not only as a place of worship, but also as a centre for community life. Religious leaders and their families often lived nearby in buildings known as rectories, which provided both residence and workspace for clergy. These houses were typically larger than surrounding homes, reflecting their role in hosting visitors and supporting parish activities. The presence of a rectory, therefore, represented both spiritual leadership and social connection within the village structure. Borley itself was not widely known beyond the surrounding region for much of its history. its population remained small, and daily routines were shaped by seasonal agricultural work and church traditions. In environments like this, stories and local legends sometimes develop naturally over time, influenced by generations of shared memory. Rural communities often carry oral traditions that blend historical fact with folklore, particularly when locations are associated with past events or notable figures. These narratives can contribute to how places are perceived, even before specific incidents occur. The landscape around Borley added to its distinctive character. Fields stretched outward toward wooded areas, and the countryside provided a sense of separation from larger towns. At night, darkness would settle across the village with minimal artificial lighting, creating quiet conditions that could heighten awareness of sounds or movement. Environments with limited external noise often make small disturbances more noticeable, particularly within older buildings where structural sounds may occur naturally due to age and weather changes. During the late 19th century, Borley remained a place where life followed predictable rhythms. Residents attended church services, worked the land, and maintained relationships shaped by long familiarity. The presence of a rectory near the church grounds fit naturally within this environment, serving as part of the village identity. At the time, there was little reason to expect that the building would later become associated with widespread attention or unusual reports. Communities like Borley often respond strongly to stories that involve local landmarks, especially when those stories attract outside interest. The sense of shared identity can become intertwined with the reputation of a particular location, whether positive or negative. Over time, the village itself would become connected to the narrative surrounding the rectory, even though the daily lives of most residents remained ordinary. This connection between place and story would shape how Borley was remembered in later years. For now, however, the village existed as many rural communities did, quiet and steady, shaped by routine and tradition. The fields, church, and surrounding homes formed a landscape that appeared calm and familiar. It was within this setting that a building would stand, gradually becoming associated with experiences that would bring attention far beyond the boundaries of the countryside, transforming Borley from a quiet village into a location remembered across the country. Borley Rectory was constructed in 1862 under the direction of Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis-Bull, who served as the rector of the parish at that time. The building stood close to the church grounds, positioned within the rural landscape that surrounded the village. Designed as a family residence rather than simply a place of work, the rectory reflected the Victorian style common during that period. With multiple rooms, staircases, and corridors arranged across a relatively large footprint compared to other nearby homes, its size and structure gave it a distinctive presence within the quiet village environment. The house was intended to accommodate both the rector's family and the responsibilities associated with parish life. Clergy residences often served as social centres where visitors were received, meetings were held, and parish matters were discussed. As a result, rectories were typically larger and more complex than ordinary cottages, containing guest rooms, studies, and storage areas alongside living quarters. This combination of domestic and professional space created an environment where activity could vary throughout the day, influenced by both family routines and community interactions. Reverend Bull lived in the rectory with his wife and their children for many years, and during that period the house functioned much like any other family home. Daily life involved household tasks, religious duties, education for the children, and participation in village activities. There were no widely documented unusual occurrences during the earliest years of occupancy. However, as with many old buildings, small sounds and structural changes would naturally occur due to weather, aging materials, and the settling of foundations. Such sounds can sometimes take on greater significance when interpreted within certain contexts, especially in older properties with long histories. Over time, stories began to circulate locally about the grounds surrounding the rectory. Some accounts referred to sightings of figures near the churchyard or along pathways connecting the buildings. It is difficult to determine how early these stories originated, or whether they were influenced by imagination, coincidence, or misunderstanding. Rural communities often develop narratives connected to historical sites, particularly when those sites involve religious buildings or burial grounds. These early stories would later become part of the broader reputation associated with the rectory. After Reverend Ball's death, the rectory continued to serve as a residence for subsequent clergy members and their families. Each new occupant brought different experiences and perspectives, shaping how the house was perceived over time. Changes in residence can sometimes alter the atmosphere of a property, not because the building itself changes, but because expectations and interpretations vary among individuals. What one family considers ordinary may appear unusual to another, depending on personal beliefs and sensitivities. Architecturally, the rectory included features that could contribute to unusual sensory experiences. Long hallways, multiple doors, and staircases can create echoes or shifting air pressure when doors are opened or closed. Older plumbing systems and wooden frameworks may produce sounds that resemble movement or footsteps. In large Victorian houses, such phenomena are not uncommon, particularly during nighttime when surrounding noise levels are low. These environmental factors may later influence how occupants interpret experiences within the building. By the early 20th century, Borley Rectory had already developed a modest local reputation for being unusual, though it had not yet gained widespread public attention. The combination of its age, structure, and surrounding folklore created an environment where stories could develop gradually. It remained, however, primarily a family home situated within a quiet village, functioning as part of the parish community. Only later would the experiences reported by new residents transform its reputation into something far more widely known, drawing investigators and media attention that would shape its legacy for decades. In 1927, Borley Rectory became the home of Reverend Guy Eric Smith and his wife, who moved into the property as part of his duties within the parish. Like previous occupants, they expected the house to function as a typical clergy residence. The building itself, though large and somewhat aged, appeared suitable for their needs, and at first there was little reason to anticipate that their time there would attract wider attention. However, within a relatively short period after moving in, the Smiths began noticing occurrences that they found difficult to explain. One of the earliest experiences described by Mrs. Smith involved unexplained sounds within the house, particularly at night. Reports mentioned footsteps in hallways, knocking noises, and the sensation that doors were moving without obvious cause. Older houses can produce a range of sounds due to temperature changes, shifting materials, or air pressure differences, yet the frequency and timing of these disturbances led her to feel uneasy. When unfamiliar noises occur repeatedly in a new environment, they can create heightened awareness, especially when occupants are still adjusting to the building. Another experience that gained attention involved the discovery of objects appearing in unexpected locations. Mrs. Smith reported finding small items, such as stones or fragments, inside rooms where they had not previously been present. Situations like this can have multiple explanations, including accidental movement or overlooked sources. But in this context, they contributed to the growing sense that something unusual might be occurring. The combination of sounds and unexplained objects began to shape how the family perceived the house. The Smiths also described moments where lights appeared to behave unpredictably, including flickering or changes in brightness. Electrical systems in older buildings were often less reliable than modern installations, particularly if wiring had aged or been modified over time. Even so, when such occurrences are combined with other unusual experiences, they may be interpreted differently by occupants. Perception is often influenced by context, and when individuals already feel uncertain, additional events can reinforce concern. Emotional responses to unfamiliar environments can vary widely. Moving into a large, unfamiliar house in a quiet rural setting may create a sense of isolation, particularly during evenings when external activity is limited. The rectory's size, combined with its long corridors and multiple rooms, may have contributed to feelings of unease, especially when sounds echoed through the structure. Such environments can amplify perception of ordinary events, making them seem more significant than they might otherwise appear. As the Smith family continued living in the rectory, their experiences gradually became known to others in the village. Conversations with neighbors and parish members sometimes included mentions of unusual occurrences, which contributed to the development of the house's reputation. When stories are shared within a community, they can influence expectations, and new occupants may become more attentive to details that align with existing narratives. This process can strengthen belief that a location is associated with unusual activity. Eventually, the Smiths decided to contact individuals who had experience investigating such reports, hoping to gain clarity or reassurance. Their decision marked an important turning point, as it brought outside attention to the rectory and set the stage for involvement from investigators who would later play a significant role in shaping its public image. What had begun as private experiences within a household was gradually evolving into a situation that would attract national curiosity, transforming Borley Rectory into one of the most discussed locations of its kind in England. As the Smith family's experiences at Borley Rectory became more widely discussed, they eventually came into contact with Harry Price, a researcher known for his interest in investigating unusual phenomena. Price had already developed a reputation through earlier work examining claims of paranormal activity, and he approached cases with a combination of curiosity, documentation, and public engagement. When he learned about the reports connected to the rectory, he arranged to visit the property in order to observe conditions firsthand and gather information from those involved. Price's arrival marked a turning point in the story, as his involvement brought a more structured form of investigation alongside increased public attention. He conducted interviews with the Smith family and others who had spent time in the house, recording descriptions of sounds, movements, and other reported occurrences. His approach included note-taking, observation, and attempts to identify patterns that might explain what was happening. For the residents, having someone willing to examine the situation seriously provided a sense of validation, even as questions remained unresolved. During his time at the rectory, Price reported witnessing certain events that he considered noteworthy, including objects appearing to move or being displaced. Such observations contributed to his belief that the location warranted further investigation. However, as with many cases involving unusual claims, interpretations varied. Observers may perceive events differently depending on expectations, lighting conditions, or emotional context. Price's conclusions reflected his own perspective, while others later suggested alternative explanations rooted in environmental factors or human behavior. Price also introduced experiments intended to document or provoke activity within the house. Investigative methods during that period often included placing objects in specific positions, marking areas to detect movement, or conducting overnight observations. While such methods aimed to capture evidence, they also introduced additional variables, as the presence of investigators can alter the behavior of occupants or the environment itself. Psychological factors, including suggestion and anticipation, sometimes influence how events are experienced during investigations. Media interest increased significantly once Price became involved. Journalists were drawn to the story, partly because of Price's reputation, and partly because the idea of a potentially unusual house captured public curiosity. Newspaper coverage expanded awareness beyond the local village, transforming Borley Rectory into a topic discussed across the country. The combination of investigation and media attention created a feedback effect, where reports of events attracted interest, which in turn encouraged further reporting. Price would later return to the rectory under different circumstances, continuing his involvement over several years. His documentation, including written accounts and photographs, played a major role in shaping the narrative that surrounded the property. Some observers regarded his work as thorough and valuable, while others questioned his conclusions or methods. This mixture of support and skepticism became part of the broader story, illustrating how interpretation of unusual events can vary widely depending on perspective. For Borley Rectory, the presence of Harry Price transformed the situation from local curiosity into national attention. The house became associated not only with reported experiences, but also with formal investigation, creating a legacy that would persist long after the events themselves had ended. The investigation introduced new questions alongside existing ones, setting the stage for continued reports, debate, and fascination that would define the rectory's reputation for decades. As attention surrounding Borley Rectory increased, a growing number of reported experiences began to emerge from individuals who had spent time inside the building. These accounts came from residents, visitors, investigators, and occasionally members of the local community. The descriptions varied in detail and intensity, but many shared common themes involving unusual sounds, movement of objects, and visual impressions that witnesses found difficult to explain. Over time, the accumulation of stories contributed to the rectory's reputation as an unusual location. One of the most frequently described experiences involved unexplained noises within the house. Witnesses reported hearing footsteps along corridors, knocking sounds on walls, and doors opening or closing without visible cause. In large Victorian buildings, such sounds can sometimes result from structural movement, air pressure changes, or shifting materials, particularly during nighttime when external noise is minimal. However, when occupants perceive sounds as patterned or intentional, they may interpret them differently, especially if they are already aware of previous stories connected to the location. Another category of reports involved objects appearing to move or change position. Some individuals described items falling unexpectedly, or being discovered in places where they had not previously been noticed. These occurrences were often interpreted as evidence of external influence, though alternative explanations, such as accidental displacement or overlooked placement, were also considered. Situations involving attention focused on specific objects can heighten awareness, making ordinary movements seem more significant. Visual experiences were also mentioned in several accounts. Some witnesses described seeing figures or shapes within the house or near the surrounding grounds, particularly during evening hours when lighting conditions were low. Human perception can be influenced by shadows, reflections, and expectation, especially in unfamiliar environments. When individuals are already aware of a location's reputation, they may become more attentive to visual details that align with those expectations. Nevertheless, such reports contributed to the sense that the rectory might involve unusual activity. There were also descriptions of temperature changes, sensations of movement, or feelings of unease experienced by those staying in the building. Emotional responses to unfamiliar environments are common, particularly in large or quiet houses where sound patterns differ from more familiar settings. Psychological factors such as anticipation, suggestion, and anxiety can influence physical sensations, shaping how experiences are interpreted. When multiple people report similar feelings, however, it can reinforce belief that the environment itself is unusual. Witness accounts sometimes differed from one another, reflecting the subjective nature of perception. Two individuals observing the same event may recall details differently, especially when the experience is brief or emotionally charged. Investigators attempted to compare accounts in order to identify patterns, though variations remained. Such differences are common in situations involving uncertainty, and they contribute to ongoing debate about interpretation. The presence of multiple witnesses nonetheless played a role in sustaining interest in the rectory. When individuals believe that others have experienced similar phenomena, it can strengthen their confidence in what they perceived. Over time, the collection of stories became part of the building's identity, shaping how new visitors approached the location. Whether interpreted through psychological, environmental, or less easily explained frameworks. The reported phenomena at Borley Rectory continued to attract attention and discussion, reinforcing its growing reputation as one of the most unusual houses in England. As reports connected to Borley Rectory continued to circulate, media interest began to expand beyond local curiosity into national attention. Newspapers during the early 20th century were often drawn to stories that combined mystery, human experience, and unusual claims, and the rectory provided all of these elements. Journalists contacted residents and investigators, gathering descriptions of events that could be shared with a wider audience. Once articles began appearing in print, public awareness increased rapidly, transforming the building from a private residence into a widely discussed location. Media coverage often emphasized the most striking aspects of reported experiences, as dramatic details naturally attract reader interest. Headlines referring to unexplained events or unusual observations encouraged curiosity, leading more people to follow the story. Public fascination with mysteries involving houses and historical locations has long been part of cultural tradition, and Borley Rectory fit easily into that narrative. The combination of a rural setting, historical building, and reported disturbances created a story that resonated with readers across the country. Visitors soon began arriving in Borley, hoping to see the rectory for themselves or speak with those connected to the events. Increased attention brought both curiosity and disruption, as residents had to manage the presence of outsiders in a quiet village environment. Situations that attract public interest can alter daily life significantly, particularly in small communities where privacy is normally expected. For those living in the rectory, the attention introduced additional stress alongside the experiences they had already reported. Harry Price's involvement contributed further to media attention. As someone already known for investigating unusual claims, his association with the case provided journalists with a recognizable figure through whom they could frame the narrative. Interviews and reports about his observations appeared in newspapers, adding credibility in the eyes of some readers, while prompting skepticism from others. The combination of investigator reputation and reported phenomena created a story that continued to develop over time, with each new article reinforcing public interest. Radio broadcasts and later publications expanded the reach of the story even further. As communication technology advanced, information about Borley Rectory reached audiences who might never have encountered it otherwise. Public curiosity about unexplained experiences often reflects broader cultural themes, including interest in the unknown and the boundaries between belief and skepticism. The rectory became a subject discussed not only by those interested in unusual phenomena, but also by individuals fascinated by historical mysteries. Public reactions varied widely. Some people expressed belief that the events represented something beyond ordinary explanation, while others viewed the situation with skepticism, suggesting natural or psychological causes. Differences in interpretation are common when evidence is uncertain, and media coverage sometimes highlighted both perspectives. Debate itself can sustain interest, as contrasting viewpoints encourage continued discussion rather than resolution. Over time, Borley Rectory became known nationally as a location associated with unusual reports. The house's reputation grew beyond its physical presence, becoming part of public conversation and cultural memory. This widespread awareness ensured that the story would continue evolving, influenced by new accounts, interpretations, and investigations that would shape how the rectory was remembered long after its original occupants had moved on. As Borley Rectory gained attention and its reputation spread, skepticism naturally emerged alongside belief. Situations involving unusual claims often invite critical examination, particularly when they attract media coverage and public curiosity. Some observers began questioning whether all reported events could be explained through natural causes, misunderstandings, or even deliberate actions. This questioning did not necessarily dismiss the experiences of those involved, but rather reflected a desire to evaluate the situation carefully and objectively. One area of skepticism focused on inconsistencies within witness accounts. When individuals describe events over time, details may change slightly due to memory evolution, emotional interpretation, or repeated retelling. In the case of Borley Rectory, variations in descriptions of sounds, movements, or sightings contributed to doubts among critics. Differences between accounts are common in situations involving uncertainty, yet they can influence how observers interpret credibility. Some skeptics suggested that these inconsistencies indicated misinterpretation rather than unexplained phenomena. Harry Price himself became a subject of scrutiny. While many people respected his dedication to investigation, others questioned his methods and conclusions. Critics argued that certain experiments conducted within the rectory lacked sufficient control or could have been influenced by suggestion. Investigations involving human perception are complex, and the presence of observers can sometimes alter behavior or interpretation. Debate surrounding Price's role became part of the broader narrative, illustrating how investigators themselves can become central figures in controversial cases. There were also moments when reported events appeared to have possible natural explanations. For example, objects found in unexpected locations could have been moved accidentally or placed without being noticed initially. Sounds within an old building might result from structural movement, plumbing systems, or external influences such as wind. Skeptics emphasized these possibilities, suggesting that environmental factors, combined with expectation, could account for many observations. When individuals anticipate unusual activity, they may become more attentive to stimuli that confirm those expectations. Some critics proposed that certain incidents might have involved intentional behavior, whether playful experimentation or attempts to reinforce belief in unusual activity. Situations where attention is focused on a location can sometimes encourage actions that contribute to the narrative, even if not intended to deceive. Human behavior is influenced by context, and environments where belief and curiosity are strong may create opportunities for misunderstandings or exaggeration. However, definitive evidence supporting deliberate staging was never fully established, leaving debate unresolved. The coexistence of belief and skepticism became one of the defining aspects of the Borley story. Supporters pointed to the number of witnesses and duration of reported experiences as reasons to consider the possibility of something unusual, while skeptics highlighted inconsistencies and alternative explanations. Such divisions are common in cases where evidence is incomplete or ambiguous. Without conclusive proof, interpretation remains influenced by individual perspective and belief. For Borley Rectory, skepticism did not diminish public interest. In many ways, debate itself sustained attention, as contrasting viewpoints encouraged continued discussion rather than closure. The presence of contradictions and unanswered questions ensured that the story remained open to interpretation, allowing it to persist in cultural memory as both a subject of fascination and critical examination. As debates surrounding Borley Rectory continued, many observers began exploring explanations grounded in psychology and environmental factors rather than unusual external causes. Large historic houses can create sensory experiences that feel unfamiliar, particularly when occupants are adjusting to new surroundings. Sounds produced by aging materials, shifting structures, or airflow through corridors may be interpreted differently depending on context. When individuals already feel uncertain or aware of a building's reputation, these ordinary stimuli can take on greater meaning. Psychological influences often play a role in how experiences are perceived. Expectation can heighten attention to particular details, making individuals more likely to notice sounds or movements that align with prior beliefs. Suggestion may also influence interpretation, especially when stories are shared among residents or visitors. If one person reports hearing footsteps or seeing movement, others may become more sensitive to similar sensations. This process does not require deliberate imagination, but rather reflects the way perception and cognition interact with expectation. Emotional factors within households can further shape experiences. Moving into a new environment, managing responsibilities, or adjusting to social pressures may create stress that affects mood and perception. Stress can increase sensitivity to sensory input, making ordinary occurrences feel more intense or significant. In families where multiple individuals share the same environment, emotional states may influence one another, creating a collective atmosphere that shapes interpretation of events. Over time, shared experiences can reinforce belief that something unusual is occurring. Environmental conditions inside Borley Rectory also provided potential explanations for certain reports. Older electrical systems could cause lights to flicker or behave unpredictably, particularly if wiring had deteriorated over decades. Temperature differences between rooms might create drafts that move doors or objects slightly, while uneven flooring could contribute to items shifting position. Plumbing noises, echoes within long hallways, and vibrations from external sources, such as wind or passing vehicles, could produce sounds resembling footsteps or knocks. In isolation, these factors might seem ordinary, but combined, they could create impressions that felt unusual to occupants. Sleep patterns may also influence perception. Individuals experiencing fatigue or disrupted sleep are more likely to misinterpret sensory input, particularly during nighttime when visibility is limited. Low lighting conditions can alter depth perception, creating shadows that appear to move or change shape. When occupants are already aware of stories associated with a location, such visual ambiguity may be interpreted as evidence supporting those narratives. Psychological research has shown that perception is not purely objective, but influenced by context, emotion, and expectation. Group dynamics can amplify these effects. When multiple people discuss experiences together, memories may evolve through conversation, gradually becoming more detailed or consistent. Shared interpretation can strengthen belief, even when initial experiences were ambiguous. Investigators studying unusual claims often consider how social reinforcement contributes to perception, recognizing that belief can develop through interaction rather than individual experience alone. Psychological and environmental explanations do not necessarily dismiss the experiences reported at Borley Rectory. Instead, they offer frameworks for understanding how ordinary factors might combine to produce perceptions that feel unusual. For some observers, these explanations provide sufficient clarity, while others continue to consider alternative possibilities. The coexistence of different interpretations reflects the complexity of human perception, illustrating how environment, emotion, and expectation interact to shape experience within unfamiliar settings. After the period involving the Smith family and Harry Price's early investigations, Borley Rectory continued to be occupied by new residents, each bringing their own experiences and interpretations to the house. Changes in occupants often influence how a property is perceived, as expectations, personalities, and daily routines differ from one household to another. Despite these changes, the rectory's growing reputation meant that new residents were often already aware of stories associated with the building before they moved in. which could shape how they interpreted events from the beginning. One of the most notable later occupants was Reverend Lionel Foyster, who moved into the rectory with his wife Marianne and their adopted daughter in the early 1930s. The Foyster family lived in the house for several years, during which time Marianne reported a number of experiences she found unusual or distressing. These accounts included sounds within the house, objects appearing to move, and written markings discovered on walls or surfaces. As with earlier reports, interpretations varied, with some observers considering the experiences significant and others suggesting alternative explanations related to environment or perception. Marianne Foyster's reports received particular attention because she kept records describing events as they occurred. Written documentation can provide valuable insight into how individuals experience and interpret situations over time, though it remains influenced by personal perspective. Her descriptions contributed to the continuing narrative surrounding Borley Rectory, reinforcing the idea that unusual occurrences might persist across different occupants, rather than being limited to a single family's experiences. Visitors and investigators continued to spend time at the rectory during this period, sometimes conducting observations or interviews similar to earlier investigations. The presence of observers could influence the environment in various ways, including increased awareness among residents and greater attention to details that might otherwise go unnoticed. Situations involving repeated observation can create feedback loops, where expectations influence perception and perception reinforces expectations. These dynamics often complicate interpretation of reported phenomena. The Foyster family eventually left the rectory, and subsequent residents reported fewer unusual occurrences, though stories continued to circulate about the house. The reduction in reports after certain occupants moved away contributed to debate about whether experiences were influenced by individuals rather than the building itself. Differences in interpretation among residents are common in historic properties, where environmental factors remain constant but personal perception changes. Over time, the rectory's reputation grew stronger, regardless of new reports. The accumulation of stories from multiple occupants created a sense that the house carried a persistent identity shaped by its past. Visitors sometimes approached the property expecting unusual experiences, which could influence how they interpreted ordinary sensory input. Reputation can become self-reinforcing, as stories attract attention that in turn generates new stories. For Borley Rectory, the period of later residence demonstrated how narratives evolve through successive experiences and interpretations. Whether influenced by environment, psychology, or belief, the reports contributed to the building's enduring reputation. The house had become more than a residence. It had become a location associated with ongoing discussion and curiosity, setting the stage for the events that would eventually lead to its destruction and transformation into a lasting historical mystery. In 1939, a significant event changed the physical history of Borley Rectory permanently. The building was severely damaged by a fire that broke out during the evening hours, eventually leaving the structure largely destroyed. Reports at the time indicated that the fire may have started accidentally, possibly connected to an overturned lamp. Older houses with wooden frameworks and aged materials can be particularly vulnerable once flames begin to spread. And in this case, the damage progressed rapidly despite attempts to respond. By the time the fire was brought under control, much of the rectory had been lost. The destruction of the building created both practical and emotional consequences. For those connected to the house, it marked the end of its use as a residence, while for observers and investigators, it removed the physical setting where so many reported events had taken place. Buildings often carry symbolic meaning when associated with stories, and the loss of the rectory contributed to a sense that a chapter of history had closed. At the same time, the absence of the structure allowed speculation to continue, as fewer opportunities remained to examine environmental factors directly. After the fire, The remaining ruins stood for a period before eventually being demolished for safety reasons. Investigators and visitors sometimes examined what remained of the site, searching for physical clues or artifacts that might provide insight into earlier reports. Among the items discovered were objects that some believed connected to the narratives surrounding the rectory, though interpretations varied widely. Without the intact structure, however, it became increasingly difficult to determine whether environmental factors might have contributed to the experiences reported over previous decades. Harry Price continued his involvement with the case, even after the building's destruction. He organized further investigations of the site, and later published accounts describing his conclusions about what may have occurred. His writings helped preserve the story of Borley Rectory in public memory, ensuring that it would remain a topic of discussion long after the physical house had disappeared. Publications often shape how historical events are remembered, as they provide structured narratives that readers can follow, even when evidence remains incomplete. The aftermath of the fire also influenced public perception. For some observers, the destruction reinforced the sense that the rectory had been an unusual location, while others viewed the loss of the building as removing an opportunity for objective examination. Situations where physical evidence is no longer available often lead to increased speculation, as questions cannot be revisited directly. Over time, the absence of the structure allowed the story to evolve further through retelling rather than observation. The site where the rectory once stood gradually returned to a quieter state, with only foundations or landscape features marking its location. Yet the reputation associated with the building did not disappear. Stories continued to circulate in books, articles, and conversations, demonstrating how narratives can persist independently of physical places. Memory and cultural interpretation often outlast structures, particularly when events involve mystery or uncertainty. Ultimately, the fire marked a turning point in the history of Borley Rectory. The building that had once served as a family home and parish residence was gone, but its story remained. The destruction shifted focus from present experiences to historical reflection, setting the stage for the rectory's transformation into one of the most widely discussed locations of its kind in England, remembered not for what could still be seen, but for what had been reported there in the past. In the years after Borley Rectory was destroyed, the story surrounding it did not fade into obscurity. Instead, it gradually became more widely known, carried forward through books, articles, and discussions that continued long after the building itself had disappeared. The phrase, "the most haunted house in England," began to appear frequently in connection with Borley, shaping public perception in a way that ensured its place in cultural memory. Labels such as this often gain influence not because they are proven, but because they capture imagination and are repeated over time. Harry Price's published accounts were central to the development of this legacy. His detailed descriptions of investigations, witness testimonies, and personal interpretations provided readers with a structured narrative that felt both investigative and mysterious. For many people, his writings became the primary source of information about Borley Rectory, influencing how the events were understood. Books can shape historical memory significantly, particularly when they combine documentation with storytelling that engages curiosity. At the same time, researchers and critics began examining Price's work more closely, questioning certain conclusions and investigative methods. This critical analysis introduced an additional layer to the legacy, as debate between belief and skepticism became part of the story itself. Some observers viewed Borley as an example of how perception and expectation can shape experiences, while others believed that at least some reported phenomena remained unexplained. The presence of disagreement did not diminish interest. Instead, it sustained discussion by allowing multiple interpretations to coexist. Media portrayals continued to revisit the rectory across decades, introducing the story to new audiences who had never seen the original building. Documentaries, radio programs, and later television features presented the case within broader discussions about unusual experiences and historical mysteries. Each retelling reinforced the reputation associated with Borley, ensuring that the narrative remained active within public consciousness. Cultural fascination with mysterious locations often persists because such stories invite reflection rather than offering clear conclusions. The absence of the physical structure contributed to this enduring interest. Without the house itself available for examination, interpretation relied on historical accounts, photographs, and written descriptions. When physical evidence is limited or no longer accessible, narratives can evolve more freely through retelling. Over time, Borley Rectory became less about a specific building and more about an idea associated with it, representing curiosity about the boundaries between explanation and uncertainty. Visitors occasionally continued to travel to the site where the rectory once stood, drawn by the story rather than the remains of the structure. The surrounding village returned to its quiet routine, yet its name remained linked to the narrative through public memory. This connection illustrates how places can become associated with stories that outlast the physical environments where events occurred. Cultural memory often preserves the emotional impact of a story, even when material traces disappear. Ultimately, the legacy of Borley Rectory reflects how human beings respond to uncertainty. When events are difficult to explain, stories develop to fill gaps in understanding. Shaped by belief, skepticism, and imagination, the house that once stood near the village church became a symbol of curiosity and debate, remembered not only for what may have happened there, but for how people interpreted those experiences. Long after the walls were gone, the narrative remained, continuing to invite reflection on how perception, environment, and storytelling combine to create mysteries that endure across generations. As we come to the end of this story, what remains most noticeable is how a single place can carry meaning far beyond its physical presence. Borley Rectory was, at its core, a family home situated within a quiet village, shaped by ordinary routines and daily responsibilities. Yet over time, experiences reported by those who lived there, combined with investigation and public attention, transformed it into something remembered across the country. Whether the events were influenced by environment, psychology, or circumstances that were never fully understood, the story reflects the human tendency to search for explanation when certainty is difficult to reach. Mysteries connected to houses often feel particularly personal because they involve environments where people expect safety and familiarity. When something appears unusual in such settings, it can challenge assumptions about what is known and predictable. The passage of time softens the intensity of those moments, allowing reflection to replace urgency. What remains is not fear, but curiosity about how perception and experience interact within unfamiliar situations. For listeners, stories like this offer an opportunity to observe human experiences from a calm distance. The steady pace of narration allows the mind to slow, creating space for relaxation without the need to resolve unanswered questions. There is no requirement to decide what explanation feels most convincing. You can simply notice the details, allow them to pass through your thoughts, and rest in the quiet atmosphere that surrounds the story. If you found this narration helpful for winding down tonight, you are always welcome here. Subscribing to the channel and leaving a like supports the creation of more calm, long-form documentaries designed for relaxation and sleep. Your presence helps this space continue to grow for others who may be seeking the same peaceful experience at the end of their day. Now, as the story fades into the background, you might notice your breathing becoming slower and more steady. The room around you is calm, the night is quiet. There is nothing more you need to focus on or understand. You can simply rest, allowing thoughts to drift gently, while sleep approaches naturally and comfortably.